There are things that a man never forgets, even when the desert tries to extinguish everything with its merciless heat. Thomas Mitchell stopped his wagon when he heard the desperate cry echo across the barren plain. The midday sun turned everything into a mirage, but that voice was too real to be an illusion. He pulled the reins of the bay horse and looked in the direction where the sound was coming from. A woman ran towards him, holding something to her chest, followed by two small children who stumbled on the hot sand. The farmer got out of the wagon slowly. His experienced eyes had seen many tragedies in those lands, but something about that scene touched him differently. The woman was too thin, with her chapped lips and sunken eyes, as if she hadn't drunk water in a long time. The children could barely stand. "We haven't had water in 2 days," she repeated as she got closer, holding out an old, worn-out Bible. "Can you buy my Bible? It's all I have to offer." Thomas looked at the holy book. The leather cover was worn out by constant use, the pages yellowed by time. He could see that this Bible was precious to the family, probably the only inheritance they had. The man took off his hat and ran his hand through his grey hair, feeling the weight of that moment. "Where do you come from?" he asked, already walking to the back of the wagon where he kept his supplies. The woman pointed to the horizon, where only rocks and cacti dotted the landscape. "Our farm was taken over by the bank. We're trying to get to Riverside, where my brother lives. But," she hesitated, hugging the children tighter, "we couldn't find water along the way." Thomas took out his canteen and a small metal basin. He poured clean, fresh water, watching as the children's eyes lit up. He knew that road well. Riverside was still a 2-day walk away, and there was not a single source of water along the way. Without help, that family would not have reached their destination alive. "Drink slowly," he said, handing it to the children first. "Too much water at once can be bad when you're very thirsty." While they were drinking, Thomas studied the situation. His farm was only a few hours away, but he was returning from a business trip to Sacramento and had urgent commitments at home. Cattle needed to be moved to the winter pastures, and his peons waited impatiently. Each day lost meant loss. But when he looked again at those children drinking water as if it were the most precious liquid in the world, Thomas felt something move in his heart. He had grown up in those barren lands. He knew the value of compassion in a place where it was as rare as water itself. The woman still held the Bible, waiting for him to tell her how much he would pay for it. The book was probably not even worth $2 on the market, but Thomas knew that its real value could not be measured in coins. It was the faith of that family, their only anchor in the midst of despair. The farmer looked up at the sky, where the sun continued its relentless march. The afternoon would be even hotter, and the night in the desert would be too cold for those who did not have adequate shelter. A decision had to be made, and he knew that any choice would have consequences that would echo far beyond that moment. The hot wind blew between them, kicking up small swirls of sand. In the silence that followed, only the sound of the children's heavy breathing broke the stillness of the desert. Thomas held the Bible that the woman was still holding toward him, feeling the weight of much more than just a book in her hands. Thomas put the Bible in the inside pocket of his vest without saying a word about payment. The woman watched him with a mixture of hope and distrust, as if she had already lost faith in human goodness, but still clung to one last thread of hope. "What's your name?" he asked, filling the children's canteen again. "Sarah," she replied, putting her hands on the shoulders of the little ones. "This is Michael, he's 7 years old, and this is Emma, 5. Her voice trembled slightly as she pronounced the names, as if she feared that saying their names out loud might make her situation even more real. Thomas waved to the children, who looked at him with that mixture of fear and curiosity typical of someone who grew up learning to be suspicious of strangers. Michael had his light hair glued to his forehead by sweat, while Emma hid behind her mother's torn skirt. "My name is Thomas," he said, crouching down to stand at the height of the children. "Do you like horses?" Michael nodded sheepishly, and Emma peered behind her mother with curious eyes. Thomas walked to his wagon and returned with some dried dates that he had saved for long journeys. The children looked at their mother for permission, and Sarah waved gratefully. As they ate slowly, savoring every little bit of the sweet fruit, Thomas worked out his options. He could give them enough water for a few days and point them to the safest way to Riverside. Or he could take them to his farm, ensuring that they arrived alive at their destination, but losing precious days of work. "Where was your husband when they lost the farm?" he asked, trying to better understand the family's situation. Sarah's face closed like a windswept door. "James died last winter. Pneumonia." She paused, swallowing her tears. "I tried to keep the farm running, but the debts were many. The bank didn't want to wait." Thomas knew this story. I had seen dozens of families go through the same situation in recent decades. The West was ruthless to widows and orphans, and the banks rarely showed compassion. The land that promised freedom and prosperity often exacted prices that few could afford. "Riverside is still far away," he said, looking up at the horizon where the heat created invisible waves in the air. "And this is not the best way to get there." Sarah felt her heart tighten. "It's the only way we know." Thomas pulled a worn-out map from his shirt pocket and spread it out on the floor. With his finger, he traced a different route, longer, but with known water points. "Around here you find a stream after a day of walking, and there's a small town, Cedar Falls, where they can rest." The woman studied the map carefully, trying to memorize every detail. He knew he depended on that information to keep his children alive. How long would it take? Walking with the children? About 5 days, maybe 6. Sarah closed her eyes and did the math mentally. 5 days in the desert with 2 small children, even following a path with water, would be a dangerous journey. But it was his only option. "I had no money to buy horses or hire a cart." Thomas folded the map and handed it to her. "Stay with him. You're going to need it more than I do." "I can't accept it," Sarah protested. They were already very kind. "A map is only valuable if it can save lives," Thomas replied, putting his hat back on, "and you need him more than I do." He walked to the wagon and returned with a canvas bag containing more supplies: jerky, biscuits, a small metal pan, and a thick blanket. Sarah watched him pile everything on the floor, unable to believe the stranger's generosity. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. Thomas stopped and looked at the children, who were playing with small stones in the sand as they finished eating the dates. For a moment, his face hardened, as if a painful memory had surfaced. "Because someone once did the same for me," he said simply. The sun began to tilt westward, painting the sky with orange tones. It would soon be time to find shelter for the night, and Thomas knew that his decision could no longer be postponed. He looked at his wagon, then at the family that now depended on his choice, and felt the weight of responsibility tighten his chest like an iron walrus. The wind changed direction, bringing with it the smell of distant rain. Thomas looked up to the horizon and saw dark clouds gathering far, far away to bring relief that day. But the change in the air brought back a memory that he had been trying to keep buried for years. He was 15 years old when his own family went through the same ordeal. His father had died in a horse accident, leaving him, his mother, and 2 younger sisters on a farm they could barely maintain. It was a passing stranger, a merchant named Samuel, who gave them enough food to survive the harshest winter that this region had ever seen. "Get on the wagon," Thomas said suddenly, surprising even himself. Sarah stared at him without understanding. "How did you say?" "Get on the wagon. I'm going to take you to Riverside." The woman shook her head vigorously. "We cannot accept it. He has already done too much for us." Thomas walked over to her and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Sarah, look at your children. Look closely. They won't be able to walk 5 days in the desert, even with water and food." Sarah looked at Michael and Emma, who were now asleep leaning against each other in the shadow of the wagon. The boy had a fever. She could see by the flush on his small cheeks. The girl was too pale, with dark circles under her eyes that shouldn't exist on the face of a 5-year-old. "My pawns can wait a few more days," Thomas continued. The cattle too, but these children can't. Tears began to roll down Sarah's face. It was the first time she had cried since they lost the farm, as if all the accumulated pain had finally found a way out. "We can't afford it," she whispered. Thomas took the Bible from his pocket and put it back in her hands. "They have already paid. With this, here." He touched the worn cover of the book. "My mother had one just like it." He read to us every night, even when we didn't have anything to eat the next day. He said that faith was the only treasure that no one could steal from us. Sarah hugged the Bible to her chest, feeling its real value for the first time in days. It wasn't just a book that I could exchange for food or water. It was the most precious inheritance he could leave to his children, even in the midst of the greatest adversity. Thomas began to rearrange the supplies in the wagon, making room for the 3 unexpected passengers. He mentally calculated the change in his plans. 2 days to get to Riverside, 2 more to return. 4 days away from the farm at a crucial time of year. But when he looked at Michael trying to wake Emma up so she would drink more water, Thomas knew he had made the right decision. Some things were more important than schedules and profits. Some things were worth the sacrifice. "There's a decent boarding house in Riverside," he said, helping Sarah fit the kids in the back of the wagon. "The owner is called Martha. She's a good woman. She will help you settle down until your brother arrives." "How do you know he's going to arrive?" asked Sarah, a shadow of doubt running through her eyes. Thomas stopped what he was doing and stared at her directly. "He will arrive, and if it doesn't arrive, Martha meets families who need help with children. Riverside is not like the big cities. People there still help each other." Sarah nodded, allowing herself to believe for the first time in weeks that perhaps there was hope for her and her children. She settled next to the children, while Thomas climbed into the driver's seat. The sun was beginning its final descent when the wagon set in motion. The pace was slower now, careful not to shake the little passengers too much. Thomas occasionally looked back to check on them, always finding Sarah watching over the children's sleep with the dedication of a sentry. 2 hours later, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas saw smoke rising over the horizon. It wasn't smoke from a campfire. It was too dense, too dark, and it came exactly from the direction where his farm was. He pulled the reins, stopping the wagon abruptly. Sarah woke up and followed her gaze to the column of smoke that stained the night sky. "What is that?" she asked, already dreading the answer. Thomas did not immediately respond. His experienced eyes analyzed the distance, the intensity of the smoke, the direction of the wind. All the evidence pointed to a single dire conclusion, and now he faced an even more difficult choice than the first. Thomas remained motionless for long minutes, watching the smoke rise like an ominous prayer against the starry sky. His fingers clutched the reins until his knuckles turned white, while his mind quickly calculated the possibilities. The distance, the direction of the wind, the color of the smoke, everything indicated that the fire was exactly where his farm was. Sarah noticed the tension emanating from him like the heat of a furnace. "It's your home, isn't it?" she asked in a low voice, fearing to confirm what she already suspected. "It could be," Thomas replied, his voice as rough as parched leather. "Or it could just be a natural fire. It happens a lot here at the end of the summer." But he knew it wasn't true. He knew his land as a sailor knows the sea, and that smoke came from where his stables and his main house were. 20 years of hard work, 20 years building something solid in a land that devoured dreams like a hungry animal. The children were still asleep, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Michael had leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, while Emma snuggled against the blanket Thomas had given. Their breaths were calm, finally free of the anxiety that had plagued them for the past few days. Thomas got out of the wagon and walked a few steps into the smoke, as if the proximity might reveal more details about the disaster. The night wind brought a smell that confirmed his worst fears: burnt wood, straw, and something else he preferred not to identify. Your horses, your cattle, his entire life turned to ashes. "You need to go back," Sarah said, getting out of the wagon carefully so as not to wake the children. "You need to see what happened. Save what you can." Thomas turned to her, and even in the darkness Sarah could see the pain in her eyes. "And abandon you here, in the middle of the desert, at night? We survived 2 days without water. We can survive 1 night." "No," he said firmly. "I will not repeat the mistakes I have seen others make. I've seen men lose their souls, trying to save their possessions." Thomas got back into the wagon and picked up a small telescope that he kept among his belongings. He climbed a nearby rock and pointed the instrument in the direction of the smoke. What he saw made his stomach constrict like a clenched fist. The flames still danced on the horizon, but they were smaller now, more controlled. It was not an out-of-control fire. It was something deliberate, calculated. When she stepped down from the rock, Sarah was waiting with an expression that mixed guilt and determination. "It was because of us," she said. "If you hadn't stopped to help us, you'd be there to defend your property." "We don't know that," Thomas replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "We do know. You said your peons were waiting, that you had to move the cattle. If it was all planned, someone knew you wouldn't be there today." Thomas put the telescope away and leaned against the side of the wagon. Sarah was right, and they both knew it. In recent months, he had had problems with a group of men who wanted his land to expand a mining operation. They had made offers, then threats, and finally promises that they would get the property one way or another. Thomas had ignored everything, trusting in his reputation and the loyalty of his pawns. "My name is Sarah Henderson," she said suddenly, reaching out as if they were meeting for the first time. "My husband was James Henderson. Maybe you've heard of him." Thomas frowned, trying to connect the name to some memory. Then his face lit up with recognition. Henderson, the man who faced the Blackstone Mining Company in court. The same. He lost the legal battle, and it cost us our farm. The debts from the process are what really led us to ruin. Sarah paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "If the same men are after your land, Thomas, they won't stop until they get what they want. Coming back now might be just what they've been waiting for." The revelation struck Thomas like a bolt of lightning. Blackstone had tried to buy his property 3 times in the past year, always increasing the offer, always becoming more insistent. When he last refused, the company's representative had said something about other ways to resolve the situation. "So you know what kind of men they are," he said, looking again at the smoke on the horizon. "I know, and I know that if you come back now, alone and at night, you may never come back. They want you to show up. They want to finish what they started." Michael shifted in his sleep, muttering something unintelligible. Sarah quickly returned to the children, checking that they were well covered. The desert temperature plummeted after sunset, and she knew how dangerous the nighttime cold could be for debilitated children. Thomas observed her care for her children and felt a twinge of something he hadn't experienced in years. Envy, perhaps, or nostalgia. He had never had children, had never met anyone willing to share the hard life of a farmer in the middle of the desert. Now at 48, she was beginning to question whether the choices she had made were worth it. "Sarah," he said after a long silence, "if I go to Riverside with you, if you make sure you get to your brother safely, would you do anything for me?" "Anything," she replied without hesitation. "If I don't come back from there, if something happens to me, you would tell people today's story. I would tell you that there was a man who chose to do the right thing, even when it cost him dearly." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. "You're going back, Thomas. He will rebuild his farm. He will continue his life." "Maybe, but if I don't come back, I want my last acts to have meaning. I want my last choices to have been the right ones." Thomas climbed back into the seat of the wagon and took the reins. The smoke on the horizon was receding, but it was still visible against the stars. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to return, to fight for what he had built, not to let bad men triumph without resistance. But when he looked at the children sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, when he saw Sarah holding the Bible as if it were an anchor in the midst of the storm, Thomas knew there was only one choice to make. The same one that the merchant Samuel had done decades ago, when he chose to help a desperate family instead of looking out only for his own interests. "Riverside is 2 days from here," he said, making the wagon move again on the dusty road. "We'll get there. I'll make sure you're safe, and then we'll see what's left to rebuild." Behind them, the smoke continued to rise against the night sky, carrying with it the dreams of a lifetime. But ahead, the stars shone with a silent promise that even on the darkest nights there was always a light to guide the lost back home. The morning arrived with the delicacy of an unexpected blessing. The sun rose, painting the sky pink and gold as Thomas's wagon crossed the last few miles before Riverside. The children had woken up more rested, with better colors on their faces, and Sarah held her Bible open, silently reading the words that had brought comfort to generations of her family. Thomas had driven all night, stopping only to water the horses and check that his passengers were comfortable. His eyes burned with weariness, but his heart was strangely at peace. The smoke on the horizon had disappeared with the first light of dawn. But he didn't look back even once. Riverside appeared as a mirage that gradually materialized. First there were the well-kept fences, then the green fields fed by the river that gave the city its name, and finally the first houses with their flowering gardens. It was a marked contrast to the barrenness of the desert they had traversed, a reminder that life always found a way to flourish where there was water and care. Martha's boarding house was in the center of the small town, a 2-story building with flowered balconies and white curtains on the windows. Thomas stopped the wagon in front of the establishment and slowly descended, feeling every muscle in his body protest after the long journey. Martha was exactly as he had described, a middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and hands calloused from honest work. She went out to greet them as soon as she heard the noise of the wagon, and her face softened immediately at the sight of the weary children and the woman who had clearly been through great hardships. What followed was a silent dance of understanding and compassion. Martha didn't ask unnecessary questions, just guided Sarah and the kids inside, pointing to clean rooms with plush beds and promising a hot meal within minutes. Thomas watched everything from afar, pleased to see that his confidence in human goodness had been justified. While waiting in the main hall of the boarding house, Thomas wrote a letter to Sarah's brother, explaining the situation and asking him to come and pick up the family as soon as possible. He left enough money to pay for lodging for 2 weeks and a little longer for emergencies, ignoring Sarah's silent but eloquent protests. 2 hours later, when the children were bathed, fed, and sleeping in real beds, Thomas prepared to leave. Sarah met him on the porch of the boarding house, where he gazed out over the river that flowed peacefully beyond the houses. She approached and placed the Bible in her hands. This time, Thomas did not protest. He knew he needed her more than Sarah at that moment. The woman had found her safety and that of her children. Now he was the one who would face the unknown. Thomas kept the holy book in the inside pocket of his waistcoat, in the same place where he had kept it the first time. The familiar weight brought a strange sense of completeness, as if a circle was closing in a way he didn't yet fully understand. The return journey began under the midday sun. Thomas had bought provisions at Riverside and traded his tired horses for rested animals. The road that would take him back home seemed different now, as if every mile traveled had changed not only his location, but also his perspective on the world. The first sign that something had changed definitely appeared when he was still a few hours from his property. 3 horsemen approached from the road, and Thomas immediately recognized the uniforms of the Blackstone Mining Company. They didn't seem surprised to see him, confirming their suspicions that it had all been planned. The leader of the group was a thin man with scars on his face and eyes that reflected calculated cruelty. He smiled as he saw Thomas alone in the wagon, clearly pleased with the outcome of his plans. The other 2 men flanked the road, blocking any possibility of escape. Thomas stopped the wagon and waited. There was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet resignation of someone who had made peace with his choices. His right hand rested casually in the pocket where he kept the Bible. and he could feel the familiar texture of the worn leather against his fingers. What happened in the following minutes was quick and definitive. The men at Blackstone had come to make one last deal or eliminate the only obstacle to their expansion plans. Thomas had hoped for this, but he had not imagined that he would feel so calm in the final moment. When it was all over, the sun was still shining in the blue desert sky, and the wind was still blowing through the cacti as if nothing had changed. But something fundamental had changed in the order of things. Sarah's Bible remained where Thomas had fallen, its pages opening to the wind and revealing words about sacrifice, redemption, and the value of a life lived with purpose. 3 days later, a lone ranger arrived in Riverside with news about Thomas Mitchell. Martha listened to the story in silence, her hands automatically working on an embroidery as she processed the information. When the man finished speaking, she went upstairs to the room where Sarah was anxiously waiting for her brother's arrival. Sarah received the news with tears that mixed pain and gratitude. She immediately understood the sacrifice Thomas had made, and she knew she would carry his story for the rest of her life. That night, she read to Michael and Emma the same passages her mother had read to her decades ago, the same ones Thomas carried in his pocket when he met his destination on the dusty road. Sarah's brother arrived the next morning, and the family was finally reunited after months of separation and grief. They settled in a small house on the outskirts of Riverside, where the children could play again without the fear that had haunted their final months. Years later, when Michael and Emma were adults, Sarah still told the story of the farmer who chose to save a family instead of protecting his possessions. The story spread throughout the region, passing from mouth to mouth like the best legends of the Wild West. But for those who knew her closely, she was not a legend. It was a reminder that even in the most arid lands, human kindness could flourish like a flower in the desert, leaving seeds that would grow far beyond the lives of those who planted them. The Bible was found days later by a pastor who was passing by the road. He took her to the Riverside Church, where she remained for decades, her yellowed pages silently testifying about a man who proved that some things are more valuable than life itself. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew through the windows of the small church, it was possible to hear echoes of the choices that define not just a life, but the legacy it leaves behind. If this story of courage and sacrifice has touched your heart as the warm desert wind touches the soul of those who traverse its vastness, you can't miss our next journeys through the dusty paths of the American Wild West, where men and women face choices that define not only their destinies, but the legacy they leave for future generations. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives about honor, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit in lands where compassion is rarer than clean water, and leave your comment below telling what was the most emotional moment of this story for you.